You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Monster House presents.
Monster Talk's a proud member of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, home of such shows as Subtext, The Projection Booth, and the Daily Meditation Podcast. If you'd like to advertise on this show, contact sales at advertisecast.com.
It's actually quite unlike anything we've ever seen before.
A giant, hairy creature, part ape, part man.
In Loch Ness, a 24-mile-long bottomless lake in the Highlands of Scotland. It's a creature known as the Loch Ness Monster.
Monster Talk.
Welcome to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
This week, longtime friend of the show, Dr. Justin Mullis joins us to talk about the cryptozoology DNA present in Godzilla. And yeah, that's metaphorical, yet it's more on the nose than you might imagine. Now, Justin was just at G-Fest, the Chicago-based convention for all things Kaiju, this very weekend giving a talk about this topic, and I'm grateful that he took the time to give some of that information to you, our audience here at Monster Talk. Justin Mullis now has his Ph.D. in American Culture Studies from Bowling Green State University in Ohio. He got his master's in Religious Studies from the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, where his area of focus was on the intersection of religion and pop culture. He teaches on diverse topics likely of interest to our listeners, including the role of dinosaurs in pop culture, religion in horror films, and cryptozoology in American culture. Let's get to that.
Monster Talk.
Hey, welcome to Monster Talk, and welcome back to Monster Talk, Dr. Justin Mullis.
He is
Thank
transformed.
I'm happy to be back.
Yeah, when we last talked, you were still working on that program, but you've gotten a degree using monsters.
We're jealous, yeah.
Yeah, so when I was last on here with you guys in 2019, Blake and we had just met in real life at the Gods and Monsters conference earlier that year at Texas State, and he had heard me give my presentation there about Thomas Jefferson as possibly the first cryptozoologist in America. I feel like considering the topic we're going to be talking about today, I should clarify that. First cryptozoologist in America.
Yeah.
I had mentioned at the end, that I was trying to find a doctoral program. And so later in that same year, based on some advice from some good friends and colleagues, especially I should give a shout out to Nick Clark. So I ended up applying and getting accepted to the American Culture Studies program at Bowling Green State University in Ohio, where I ended up going to do my PhD with my focus being on looking at this idea of cryptozoology and American culture, and specifically early American culture. They were very receptive to that kind of work and that being an avenue that I could explore. And it turned out to be a great university to do that kind of work at because of that American Culture Studies program. And also, they have a very well-regarded and well-renowned pop culture studies program here, which is kind of connected at the hip to the American Culture Studies program. And one of the things that Bowling Green is famous for with that regard is they have the Ray and Pat Brown Pop Culture Library here, which is one of the largest archived collections of pop culture related ephemera. So that was really useful for me as far as giving me access to a lot of classical like science fiction and fantasy and pulp fiction texts, which tied in with a lot of my work and my scholarship. But they also have a lot of material related to Forteana and the paranormal as part of that collection. They've got like a complete run of every issue of Fate magazine. They've got all kinds of books and monographs. Some of that stuff I know I'd posted online, like on my Facebook page and stuff, because I would request something. Like at one point I requested a copy of Mark Hall, the famous cryptozoologist's book on thunderbirds, and instead of getting the sort of standard copy, I got this early like DIY version that he had done that they happened to have in their collection.
Wow.
So
That's an important archive. Yeah.
Yeah. Bowling Green's library is also the home of the Invisible Ink collection. It's all books relating to the paranormal, and they've all been donated by somebody I believe you've had on the show before, which is Ohio folklorist Chris Woodyard. So,
wow, yes.
Oh,
wow.
yes.
So
Yes.
all of her books that she's donated from her personal library and collection over the years are here. So both of those collections, between the Ray and Pat Brown and the Invisible Ink collection, are a fantastic resource for anybody who's wanting to do work relating to the paranormal and the Forteana in an academic setting. So yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's really exciting. So a lot has happened since we last spoke with you. And one of those things is that you've been working on a paper, and that's why we brought you on today to talk about this. So could you briefly describe the main theme of your paper, from cryptids to kaiju, and what inspired you to write it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the most recent piece of scholarship that I've had published. It came out earlier this year. It's in the journal, the Interdisciplinary Science Review. The full title is From Cryptids to Kaiju: Exploring Heterodox Paleoscience with Godzilla. And this was part of a larger series of articles that the Interdisciplinary Science Review are doing under the editorial guidance of two scholars, Richard Fallon and Eddie Guimont, who I know and are great friends and colleagues, and they're interested in basically, as part of my title there, heterodox paleoscience or paleontology. And so that includes things like cryptozoology and other stuff. So they had reached out to me about if I had wanted to contribute to this series that they were doing. And I said, yes. I had an idea for this, which was, it originally started off as I was wanting to write something about, and it was kind of based on a blog post I had done at one point years ago about, the paleontology of Godzilla, right? Like what actually is Godzilla from a paleontological kind of perspective. And then I sort of realized that article had been written several times over already. And then in the process of working on this, it kind of expanded into this different thing, which was really looking at the history of cryptozoology in Japan, and then also talking about how that history then eventually manifests itself into the form of this global pop culture icon, which is Godzilla, who is, really having a moment right now also in sort of global popular culture.
First of all, let me say something about your paper. I read a lot of academic papers. I am not an academic, even though I do aspire to be one in some ways. So this is
the talk.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that, Karen. And I try to do the research at an academic style, but I just don't have the proper training, I think, that I'd like to have. So I may have accidentally absorbed some, but this is a very accessible paper. And I think so for some of our readers who might sometimes be intimidated by reading journal articles, this one's different. So I hope they are able to find a copy of it. In this paper, you define cryptozoology, but what does it mean in this paper's, from this paper's reference, and how does it relate to heterodox paleoscience, which is something you talk about a lot?
Those are definitely related kind of issues. So I think within the kind of broader theme that Eddie and Richard kind of had in mind when they're talking about the idea of heterodox paleoscience or heterodox paleontology, they just mean anything that is not necessarily accepted by sort of the scientific mainstream. So in more kind of common parlance, what you would call like pseudoscience, right? So paleontological pseudoscience. Now, one of the things that, and this was a conversation that I had with both Eddie and Richard early on, is that all of us kind of have difficult feelings about the term pseudoscience. We think in some ways it's overly general. It doesn't really do a good job of telling you what is the issue with something other than saying, well, it's not science. And it's like, well, we've kind of already established that it's not science. How is it not science? Why is it not science? How are you kind of defining that? And so they really encouraged me, and I cite his work in my paper, to kind of look at historian of science Michael D. Gordon's book On the Fringe, where Gordon attempts to kind of move beyond the idea of pseudoscience, and he breaks it down into several different categories. And the two that I found to be the most useful with regards to this project and with thinking about cryptozoology is, so Gordon himself classifies cryptozoology as an example of what he calls a counter-establishment science, meaning that it pushes it back against, sort of general consensus understanding within that field. So with regards to something like cryptozoology, the most simple example of that would be, paleontologists would tell you that all non-avian dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. And then cryptozoologists would be like, no, see the Loch Ness Monster, see Mokele-Mbembe, right? See whatever, right? There are examples of non-avian dinosaurs that are still alive, and they'll say, the establishment, whatever that means, is blind to this fact. The other category that Gordon introduces that I also found to be very useful, and he doesn't put cryptozoology in this, but he acknowledges that all of these categories could probably be applied to multiple different areas, is he talks about the idea of vestigial science. And so vestigial science refers to something where you have a discipline that has refused to stay up to date with the current scholarship. And I know this is something that also like Jeb Card has written about before with regards to cryptozoology, which is this idea that, like cryptozoologists seem to still be functioning at the level of like 19th century naturalists, right? And they have not progressed into more modern ways of thinking about zoology, thinking about field biology, and those kinds of things. And this is also, again, related to like why depictions of prehistoric animals like dinosaurs, like plesiosaurs in cryptozoology also tend to be very outdated themselves, right? Like the Loch Ness Monster is this old model of a swan-necked plesiosaur that is not considered in keeping with the most latest research in the field of paleontology. Mokele-Mbembe is a swamp-dwelling sauropod. No serious paleontologist thinks that sauropods were swamp-dwelling animals. They were dryland animals, right? So those are two concepts that I talk about and I use in the article with regards to thinking about this. But then the sort of larger thing is also I'm thinking about cryptozoology itself as an example of what I call the scientification of folklore, which is a concept that I'm getting from a pair of culture studies scholars, Grimshaw and Lester, who wrote a monograph back in the 70s called The Meaning of the Loch Ness Monster. And they introduced this idea that cryptozoology should be viewed as a kind of modern folklore, and what makes it unique or different from other kinds of folklore is that it has incorporated, or we might even say appropriated, the language of science as a means of increasing its apparent veracity. And so in that sense, it doesn't necessarily matter if the science is mainstream, if it's supported by the quote-unquote establishment, or if it's even necessarily up to date, as long as it, and I use this phrase as well to borrow it from Sharon Hill, as long as it sounds science-y, it's good enough for the general public, right? And that's what's important here. So that's how I'm thinking about cryptozoology in this article, and a lot of my other work is as this kind of science-inflected folklore.
Right. Oh, well, very interesting stuff. And I wanted to get into something a bit more specific here. If we could talk about the Godzilla franchise. So how does that serve as an example of cryptozoological fiction? And could you explain how Japanese folklore, such as the stories of the Kappa or the Tengu, how have they influenced Godzilla's creation?
Part of the main aspect of this article was me looking at like the history of cryptozoology in Japan. And so one of the things that I realized was that if you're thinking about cryptozoology as this genre of folklore that is sort of inflected by and using the language and kind of the concepts of science, then this is actually something that the Japanese have been doing for a very long time with their folklore, where it would go back at least to like the 17th century, right? Because you start finding what's going on is, especially during like sort of the Tokugawa period, 1600 to 1868, which is this stretch of time in Japan where Japan becomes sort of isolated from the Western world, except for kind of limited exchange with the Dutch. This is also the period where they start working on the first sort of explorations into what we would call natural history, right? During this time period, you start having these first explorations of natural history, and the monsters of Japanese folklore are not excluded from these explorations. They are actually incorporated into it. But what's interesting here is that rather than the academics who are looking at this kind of stuff, dismissing these creatures because there's like a lack of, empirical evidence, their approach is to just kind of, it seems to be to just sort of assume that evidence must exist. So I talk about, for example, this guy, Kurimoto Tanshun, right, who lived from 1756 to 1834, and he was actually the personal physician of the shogun. And he assembles this group of scholars to investigate a particular monster from Japanese folklore, which is the kappa, which for people who aren't familiar is this kind of vampiric turtle duck-looking creature. And so Tanshu and his team go out and they collect all of these eyewitness reports, right? Hundreds and hundreds of eyewitness reports, and they collate them and they come up with a profile for the kappa, which is no different than like any other animal, right? They have anatomical features, size, color, behavior, ecosystem, habitat, everything, and they create this sort of synthesis and they publish it as a book called Suko Koreyaku, or a study of water tigers, is what that would literally translate as, water tiger being another name for the kappa. And then subsequent to that, you have a pair of naturalists, these brothers, which are Sakamoto and Juntaku Konen, who create a kind of series of illustrations based on this study, because as part of the study, Tanshu and his team decided that there's not just one type of kappa, there's like 7 types of kappa, right? And so you've got this set of eyewitness accounts that have been turned into a sort of taxonomical description, and then illustrations showing what these creatures look like, because of course they don't have any specimens to go along with it, to give people this idea of like, here's what these creatures look like. And if any of this sounds familiar to anybody, it's because this is exactly what cryptozoologists still do today, right? If you've read like the books of Lauren Coleman or Patrick Wynn, like their field guides to lake monsters or to Bigfoot, that's what those books are. They are collections of eyewitness sightings that have been synthesized into a taxonomical description of a speculative creature with an accompanying illustration to show you what these creatures are supposed to look like.
Like a real-world monster manual.
A real-world monster manual, exactly. And that's exactly what these Japanese naturalists were doing all the way back in the 17th and 18th century as well. I think that this process was really important, though, because it lended these creatures this extra degree of veracity, right? It made them feel more real to their readers, just the fact that they were being spoken of in this way and described in this way and talked about in this way. And I think that's a big part of what allowed them to endure in Japanese culture, so that, the kappa is still a very important figure in Japanese culture even today. And of course, as I mentioned in the paper, I didn't have the space to kind of go into specific examples, but there are still sightings of kappa in Japan to this day, right? They are still treated as an actual cryptid, right? People still claim to have encounters with them as a result, right? Which is not something that's necessarily true about every kind of monster or yokai in Japanese folklore, just as it's something that's not true about every kind of monster that exists in the folklore of any country. But it does seem to me that when you have that kind of veracity, that kind of stuff that's added into these legends, that's what helps to perpetuate them and helps them to endure. And that's one of the things that has made cryptids, in a way kind of like very sticky, right? They hang around even once you can sort of trace their origins to like a hoax or a misperception or something. It doesn't matter because the idea that these things are real has been so firmly planted in the public consciousness.
But it's interesting. There's parallels in sort of Western folklore monsters. There's monsters like you don't see people reporting dragons or mermaids very often, but it's not a zero. They still happen. It's just not as common. Like, most people, no, of course, dragons are ridiculous, but no, they still show up. Here's a question for you. And this is to contextualize things a bit. How does the Godzilla franchise sort of reflect these cultural, political moods over the eras and the decades? And I mean that both in your premise here, comparing the way cryptozoology translates into kaiju, but also because there is something in Japanese culture around this concept of eras that I've just sort of picked up on through things like Godzilla, the movie series, being tied to eras. But also I've seen it in anime, like in One Piece, which my family is slowly working their way through. They always talk about the Great Pirate Era and this concept of there's these ages or eras or periods of time that sometimes they're short or long. Is that tied to royalty? Where does that come from?
Obviously, you have the kind of historical eras, which are usually tied to government or what's going on. So, for example, I already mentioned the Tokugawa period, which is this period of time where the emperor still exists in Japan, but has been pushed off to the side, and instead you have this military ruling class, which is headed up by the shogun instead, which is the first shogun was Tokugawa Ieyasu, and so that's why it becomes the Tokugawa era, and then like his descendants take over afterwards, and then but then the Tokugawa era transitions into like the Meiji era, which is this period of reform, which is a reference to then back to the emperor, that's in power or the sort of the figurehead of the country at the time, which is then followed by the Taisho period, which for, again, anime fans, that's when like Demon Slayer is set during the Taisho period, which is a sort of transitional era for Japan where they're starting to attempt to modernize or westernize. So then following that, then you have the two big recent eras that you'll often hear Western Godzilla fans talk about as a way of kind of demarcating the franchises. You have the Showa era, which is basically, most of the 20th century up until into the 1980s, which is when the Showa era ends, and then the Heisei era. And again, these refer to the particular emperor, and it's by their last name and who they're being referred to. So the sort of original 17 films in the Godzilla series that are made between 1954 and 1975 are known as the Showa era films in both Japan and amongst American fans. And then the second series of films, which is from 84 to 95, is what's known as the Heisei era. And there is a little fudging going on there because the Showa era wasn't over in 84. So technically the first film from the Heisei era series is actually a Showa era film, and sometimes that's reflected in Japanese language Godzilla books because for obvious reasons they care a little bit more about this than we do about getting that exactly right. But usually even they, because they acknowledge that Return of Godzilla from 1984 is the first film in that second series of movies, so it has to be included even if it was technically made and released during the Showa era. But then the other thing that I think is interesting that I briefly reference in this paper is that the Japanese also do seem to have this thing with kind of marking certain periods in their history where there are major trends in popular culture, which is something that I don't necessarily see other cultures doing or
right.
Or us doing. So I talk about, for example, that in the 70s, cryptozoology starts getting popularized in Japan, and this is as a result of something that the Japanese remember as what they call the occult boom. And so that's one of the things that you'll see. They talk about these moments where certain ideas are trending in popular culture, and they refer to them as booms. So earlier in like the 50s and the 60s, there'd been a kaiju boom, and then there was a subsequent like yokai boom. And then in the 70s, you have what's known as the occult boom, which seems to have coincided with the prophecies of Nostradamus getting translated into Japanese for the first time. And so then people get really interested in that kind of occult or mystical material, and you see those kinds of things trending through their popular culture. And then in the late 70s and into the 80s, you have actually a UFO boom, which coincides with the release in Japan of Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And so they remember and they kind of demarcate these periods where certain things got really, really popular and we're sort of in the kind of general cultural zeitgeist. And you see that reflected then, to get to answer your question, Blake, you see that reflected in the Godzilla series, right? One of the examples that I talk about is, so you have that initial cult boom in the 70s, and then there's a subsequent kind of a cult boom in Japan also in the early 90s. And these things do parallel global trends as well, because of course that was a period in American culture where the paranormal started getting really popular again with things like the X-Files and whatnot. And I'm not entirely sure what the inciting incident was for the second like occult boom in Japan, but one of the Godzilla movies that comes out in the early 90s is the movie Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. And this film involves UFOs, it involves cryptozoology, it involves time travel, and the protagonist of the movie is actually a journalist who works for Moo magazine, which is basically the Japanese equivalent of the 40 in Times.
Wow.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. So all of that kind of stuff is being reflected in that particular film.
So speaking of movies, in what ways has Godzilla influenced real-world cryptozoology, and how has cryptozoology in turn influenced new Godzilla films?
All right, so I guess we want to go back to the very beginning. The original Godzilla from 1954. So that movie was the brainchild of Toho Studios producer Tomoyuki Tanaka. There's a lot that could be said about this, some of which is more speculative on my part that I talk about in the paper, and some of which is a little bit more direct. And I'll stick right now to the kind of really direct stuff. So Tomoyuki Tanaka has this idea that he wants to do a big monster movie. He hires a well-regarded and well-known Japanese pulp fiction writer at the time, Shigeru Kayama. Shigeru Kayama, at this point in his career, is most famous for a pair of stories he's written, which are titled The Revenge of Orang Pendek and The Return of Orang Pendek.
Whoa,
which should
really?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Which should ring some bells for some people, because, the Orang Pendek is basically the Indonesian version of Bigfoot, right?
Littlefoot, the kids are calling it. But
yeah, well, yeah, it's small, right? Yeah, so
yeah.
So this is what he's most famous for at the time, and none of Kayama's work has ever been translated into English until just late last year. So the University of Minnesota Press put out Kayama's novelizations of both the original Godzilla and the sequel Godzilla Raids Again, translated by Jeffrey Engels, who is also going to be at G-Fest this year with me giving a talk. And so, and I've been talking to Engels since before the book came out and everything. And he's confirmed for me that yes, Kayama was obsessed with what we today would call cryptozoology. He was fascinated by this idea of undiscovered or mysterious creatures, and this is primarily the kinds of stories that he wrote about in Pulp Fiction magazines. And in fact, the reason why Tanaka probably hired Kayama had less to do with his Orain Pendek stories and more to do with the fact that he'd written a number of stories up to that point, such as one called The Jira Monster, which was about a dinosaur that was bulletproof, attacking people on an island in the South Pacific. He wrote a story called Lizard Island, which was about a biologist that goes to an uncharted island in the South Pacific and discovers these giant lizards that they call demonosauruses. He had a story called The Monster Spectator, which if you look at the illustrations from the original Japanese pulp magazine that those appeared in, the monster in that story looks almost exactly like Godzilla, right? Kayama was really interested in this. He also wrote a story which might actually be, I'm trying to find out more information about this because I've been curious about the idea of, how the coelacanth became the poster child for cryptozoology, when I know, as you've talked about before on the show, it's actually a really bad case study for cryptozoology. And one of the things that I found interesting is that coelacanths don't seem to actually turn up that often in crypto fiction, but lo and behold, Kayama wrote a story called The Monster Coelacanth. So, part of this is obviously the issue of, getting this stuff translated into English, or getting a hold of copies of it and that kind of stuff. But these Godzilla novelizations have sold really well for the University of Minnesota Press. So I know Jeffrey is in talks with them about possibly getting more of Kayama's stuff translated over here. But so Kayama, being the one who writes the original Godzilla movie and Godzilla Raids Again, injects a lot of that interest in cryptozoology into the original movie. And so this is why you end up with, I think, the kind of rich fringe scientific content that you do in this film. Like, why one of the protagonists, is Dr. Yamane is a paleontologist, and that they bother to have these scenes where, he's explaining kind of like, the sort of paleontological pseudoscience of Godzilla. And one of the really interesting things in that scene, if you go back and you watch the movie, is that part of the evidence that he cites for why, the Japanese diet, the government, he's making this presentation to the government, should take these reports of this giant dinosaur monster being seen off the coast of Japan seriously, is he mentions the recent discoveries of the footprints of a snowman in the Himalayas, right?
Yeah.
So he's citing the Yeti as evidence. And that's also really interesting because the film that Kayama and Ishiro Honda, who is the director of the original Godzilla, would collaborate on right after the original Godzilla had wrapped, is a movie that in English is known as Half Human. In Japan, it's Junjin Yuki Otoko, or Beastman of the Snows. And it's a Yeti movie. And it's probably, in my opinion, the best or the second best, like 1950s Yeti movie ever made, right up there with Hammer's The Abominable Snowman. The problem is it's gotten easier to see in recent years. Toho has never released that film on home video.
Really?
Not in Japan. Yeah, not in Japan. Certainly not in the States. There's complicated reasons for that. The depiction of the people who live in proximity to the Yeti is not considered politically correct by modern Japanese standards. So that's a whole can of worms. So they've kind of buried this movie as a result. It's a very sort of like Disney Song of the South situation.
Wow. Okay.
But at some point, but they apparently they still show the movie occasionally at film screenings, because a friend of mine, Nicholas Clark, who lives in Japan, got to see it in a theater because they did a screening of it. They just won't release it on home video or on any kind of streaming platform or anything. But somebody at some point leaked a copy of the film, and so it's out there on the internet, and people keep uploading it on like YouTube or Vimeo or archive.org. And Toho keeps having it pulled down, and people just keep posting it again.
It reminds me very much of a lot of the things like the Fantastic Four movie, that Roger Corman did, where you used to only be able to get it at the back table at a convention on bootleg VHS, third generation. Everybody looks like they're made out of plastic, but yeah. Yeah,
it's one of those. It's one of those things where it's a real shame, because it's an amazing film if you can watch it, and I think it deserves a release. Probably done with the kind of proper care and consideration of, it's like, we understand that some of the content in this is problematic by modern standards, but that just doesn't seem to be something that Toho's interested in.
I've enjoyed a few things where they put a not a disclaimer, but basically a contextual informational card at the start to sort of remind you, we know, we're aware, it's important for reasons, but this is not, the content's not great now, but it's important to preserve this, this history. So yeah, that's interesting. I have actually not seen it, but I also have a bootleg, so it's on my to-do list. So
there you go.
Yeah, that is definitely how like cryptozoology directly impacted like the original conception and development of Godzilla, was that it all came through Shigeru Kayama, right? And then the other example would be the movie that I already mentioned, Godzilla versus King Ghidorah, which involves direct cryptozoology. So in particular, in that case, they cite the 1977 Zuimaru incident, which I know you guys have done a show on in the past, so I won't.
The long ago past,
yeah.
That was with Greg Cuban. Yeah, wow, that goes way back to like the first 10
memory.
episodes. Yeah.
Well, I won't belabor that, but they do directly reference the Zuimaru case in that movie. They show the photos at one point, and actually, I noticed a couple years ago when I was working on a different presentation for G-Fest, that when they show the Zuimaru photos, if you know your cryptozoology and you pay attention, they actually also show in the same scene Sir Peter Scott's famous painting of a pair of Nessies in courtship in Loch Ness. So
wow, you kind of want to see their necks intertwined to make a heart, like they see swans all the time. But I know we're running short on time, and we'll definitely have to have you back because there's some big concepts that I want to talk about. But let's, if you don't mind, briefly, let's talk about a topic that I can't seem to let go of, which is the feedback loop between folklore fiction and air quote real world cryptozoology, because you do talk about that in this paper.
A big part of my research into this is I've become increasingly convinced that there is this kind of feedback loop that exists between speculative fiction and cryptozoology, where people who are writing speculative fiction, so it can go in any number of ways, and it's one of those things. It's really appropriate what Charles Fort once said, right? You can start a circle beginning anywhere.
Yeah, fair.
So because it's either the case that you have people who are writing speculative fiction who are reading the works of cryptozoologists or other fringe researchers, right? Again, pseudoscientists, for lack of a better word, and then they are incorporating those ideas into their fiction. And then that material is getting read by both people in those communities, in those Fortean communities, and by the general public as well, in many cases. And that's either reinforcing certain beliefs that they have or providing them with particular beliefs and ideas. Again, I actually think, previous episodes you guys just did with Joe Laycock and Eric Harrelson about the Exorcist effect. I've read that book. I think Joe and Eric do an amazing job in the second chapter of that book of actually breaking down and explaining how the mechanics of this feedback loop actually work. So I'm not going to try and, summarize what they do there. People should really read that second chapter. But this feedback loop is real, and it exists, where these things are influencing each other, and they're influencing how people think about them and how these things are perceived and how they're understood in the real world. And I think you can make this case with cryptozoology just as well as you can make it with the kind of demonic beliefs that Joe and Eric are talking about, the way that somebody like Jason Colavito has made this case with regards to like ancient alien proponents and the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, right? There are multiple examples that you can cite. And what's fascinating about this is that you would think that something like Godzilla, right? You would go, well, okay, sure, I might believe you that, say the popularity of, like Bigfoot media or something would influence people to have more Bigfoot sightings, or, the success of Close Encounters of the Third Kind caused more people to interpret weird lights they'd seen in the sky as being UFOs. But certainly nobody is actually going out into the world and seeing Godzilla, right? And as I talk about at the end of my paper, this is not necessarily true. So in the Annals of Japanese Cryptozoology, there is a famous case, which is what's known as Antarctic Godzilla, which took place on February 13th, 1958. And there was a Japanese Antarctic research vessel called the Soya. And according to the captain, Mitsuji Matsumoto, at about 7 p.m., him and a lot of his crew were, looking out into the Lutzoholm Bay off the coast of Antarctica, and they saw this large creature moving through the water. And they said it resembled a whale, but with a serrated fin on its back and a head like a cow, complete with protruding ears. And nobody had a camera on them at the time. And when the chief engineer apparently left the bridge to try and go grab one, by the time he came back, the creature in question had vanished. But Matsumoto, having seen this, was reminded of the movie Godzilla. And so he wrote down the name, Nankiyoku Gojira, Antarctic Godzilla, in his log. And this has become, kind of this famous case in the annals of Japanese cryptozoology. It's not very well known outside the annals of Japanese cryptozoology, which I find kind of surprising. It doesn't get mentioned in any sort of the standard reference literature or material, or even stuff focusing like specifically on cryptid whales. But this is kind of a classic case in Japan that people talk about. And what's also interesting about this, and this kind of demonstrates and shows that feedback loop and that influence, is that because Matsumoto gave this creature, which by all accounts sounds like some kind of odd whale or marine mammal, because he gave it this name, if you look at visual depictions of it over the years in Japanese cryptozoological literature, it goes from initially being this whale or marine mammal type creature to becoming increasingly reptilian, increasingly dinosaur-like, increasingly resembling its cinematic namesake.
Oh, it's scaled up.
Exactly. For Godzilla. In a way, to draw a parallel, that's very similar to how, if you go back to the primary sources for Mothman, nobody was describing an insectoid humanoid. They were describing some kind of large bird. But because the media gave it the name Mothman, nowadays the image that you'll find if you Google Mothman is by and large this weird insectoid humanoid type creature, because that's what's happened over time, and that's influenced the sightings and even the original witnesses.
In this week's episode, we talked to our guest and asked the favorite monster, the one we just recorded. And she said Mothman, but as she described it, it was like a giant moth. And I absolutely did not want to correct her because, hey, if that's how you're encountering it in the pop culture world,
how it's evolved.
That's how it's evolved. I mean, that's not, you can't force people back to the purity of the original story because these things change over time. I mean, as a nerd, I want to say, but no, but the reality is these things morph.
Yeah.
It's part of that idea of folklore, right? Because that's why this idea of like Grimshaw and Lester's about the scientification of folklore is important, because folklore, just like a living organism, wants to survive, and to survive it has to adapt, it has to evolve. Yep. And so if that means incorporating the language of science, the vocabulary of science, making its monsters sound less fantastic and more scientifically plausible in a cryptozoological sense, which might mean, that actual scientists, actual paleontologists are groaning and rolling their eyes, but for the general public, they're going, yeah, that sounds right. That sounds believable. Mm-hmm. That sounds science-y. Then that's what's going to happen. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Justin, we're going to have to wrap things up for now, but you did mention G-Fest, and we want to have you back on the show soon for a deeper dive into some of these other concepts. But could you tell our listeners a little bit about G-Fest and what you're going to be doing there?
Yeah, so G-Fest is going to be the weekend of July 12th to the 14th. It's in Chicago. If you go online and you Google G-Fest, you can find all of the information as far as the actual hotel that they're having it at this year. In fact, I could probably tell you that myself, but I think it's at the Hyatt Regency O'Hare is what I'm seeing. So I know they've moved it recently, so definitely double check the website. But it is a long running, it's been going on since the 90s, convention for fans of the Godzilla franchise, fans of Kaiju in general, so King Kong, Gamera, Mothra, all of that kind of stuff. You get guests come in from Japan, actors, suit actors, directors, special effects people who have worked on the film. And then you also get panels that are done by various scholars or authorities on these films and their history, So, as I already mentioned, I'm going to be there delivering a talk on Japanese cryptozoology and how it's shown up and influenced Japanese popular culture. So not just the Godzilla series, but other things as well. And I already mentioned, like, this year also one of the guests is going to be Jeffrey Angles, who will be talking about the process of translating those books. And if you go online, you can get a complete, I think, listing of all the different panels. There's going to be, some great stuff from some really knowledgeable and reputable people there. I definitely should give a shout out to friends and colleagues like Kevin Derendorf and Kyle Bird. Like, look for their names, look for their panels. Those are two guys who really know this material forward and backwards, and they always do really, really interesting presentations at G-Fest on it. So
great. Exciting.
I won't be able to get this out quite in time for the regular feed, but I'll try to get this out in time so that at least our patrons will have a chance to pick up on this. I don't think the timing will work. Yeah. Based on the release schedule, but, we tried. Yeah, we tried. This is really, really good though. I really, really appreciate you coming on to talk with us about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. We obviously need to have you back and have a deeper dive where we can set aside a little longer. I want to point listeners to two things. You mentioned Eddie and Richard, and they do a podcast called The Impossible Archive, which I'll put a link to in the show notes. You should check that out. And also, you recently did an episode of The Lost Valley with friend of the show, Cian Gill, and talking about specifically Skull Island, and you talked about cryptozoology and the monsterverse there, and that was really a great conversation as well. So I'll put links to that in the show notes too.
Yeah, absolutely. The we don't have time to go into it, but that's been another really interesting thing, is that these recent American Godzilla movies, have kind of been dancing around the subject of cryptozoology for a while. And then if anybody saw the Apple TV series that tied into these movies, Monarch: Legacy of Monsters, they finally used the word.
They sure did. They dropped the C word right there on screen. It was good.
The C word.
We loved
the
it.
Other C word.
Yeah. That's right. I remember the other one now that you've mentioned it. But anyway, that was a hoot. I really enjoyed that. But again, Justin, thank you so much for coming to talk with us and for this work that you're doing, because you're practically making this stuff respectable, and I appreciate that. But
thank you. Thank you so much, Blake, for the compliments regarding the accessibility of the paper. That's something I really strive for in my academic writing. So
awesome.
Monster Talk.
You've been listening to Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm Blake Smith.
And I'm Karen Stolzno.
You just heard an interview with Dr. Justin Mullis about the connection between cryptozoology and kaiju films in Japan. Do please check the show notes for links to some other interesting interviews Justin's done with shows whose mission overlaps our own, especially if you're interested in a deep dive on King Kong and Skull Island. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Monster Talk. Each episode, we strive to bring you the very best in monster-related content with a focus on bringing scientific skepticism into the conversation. If you enjoy Monster Talk, we now have a variety of ways to support the show, all with convenient links at monstertalk.org/support. That's monstertalk.org/support. We have links there to our Patreon page as well as a donation button. Another great way to support the show is to buy books from our Amazon Monster Talk wish list, which directly helps us with our research. We love used books very much, so don't feel compelled to buy new ones, and we love Kindle so we can share our digital libraries with each other. And finally, without spending any money at all, you can support us by leaving a positive review at iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Positive reviews help keep us visible in iTunes, which is a great way to help us find new listeners. And please share our show on your favorite social media platforms. Monster Talk theme music is by Peach Stealing Monkeys. You could be doing anything with your ears, but you're listening to me, and golly, that makes me happy.
This has been a Monster House presentation.